Before we begin, hello loves. Welcome back to Charlotte's Title Whispers, the place where stories find you exactly when you need them. If you are new here, pull up a chair, pour something warm and stay a while. Drop in the comments right now. Where are you watching from? I want to know if you're reading this at midnight under a blanket, on a lunch break pretending to work, or somewhere in between. Tell me everything. And if this story moves you even a little, please subscribe. Costs you nothing and it means the world to this little corner of the internet. Now, let's begin. She had perfected the art of disappearing. Not the dramatic kind. No sweeping exits, no theatrical absences. Just the quiet, practiced invisibility of a woman who has learned that the safest place in any room is the one nobody is looking at. Miss Dorothea Crane stood at the far edge of the Aldbridge Winter Ball's eastern drawing room, one step behind Lady Petworth's chair, hands folded, face composed into the pleasant blankness of furniture. The Countess was deep in conversation with a woman in green silk whose laugh arrived 3 seconds before any joke warranted it. Nobody needed Dorothea. This was, as always, exactly the point. The room was loud in the way that money makes things loud, not with noise exactly but with the weight of it. Crystal-catching light. The particular rustle of a gown that cost more than Dorothea's yearly wage. A string quartet somewhere behind the double doors playing a waltz that nobody was dancing to yet, because nobody wanted to be the first. She could still see most of it if she stood in the right light. The edges of things had grown soft this past year. Candles blurred. Faces at distance resolved into shapes rather than features. She had learned not to reach for things too quickly, not to miscalculate the edge of a step, not to let anyone notice the half-second pause before she located the door. She had told no one. What was there to tell? I am going blind, slowly, in the way a room goes dark at evening. Not all at once, never all at once, but steadily and without ceremony, and there is nothing to be done. The physician in Clerkenwell had been very gentle about it. Very sorry. Very thorough in his explanation of why nothing could be offered beyond time. Dorothea had thanked him, paid his fee with the last of her saved coins from the previous quarter, and walked home in the November rain without an umbrella because she had forgotten it by the door and hadn't wanted to go back and admit she hadn't seen it. That had been 8 months ago. She had reorganized her life around the fact, the way you rearrange furniture around a broken floorboard. Carefully, without fuss, and without telling guests about the danger. Lady Petworth's laugh broke across the room, sharp as a dropped spoon, and Dorothea straightened automatically. The Countess needed nothing. The woman in green was refilling their conversation with her own voice, the way people fill silence with bread, compulsively and without hunger. Dorothea let her attention drift, just slightly, just to the right, toward the window alcove near the second fireplace where the light was warmer, where she could see best. That was where the child was. She was perhaps 4 years old, perhaps 5. Small in the boneless way of children who haven't yet decided where their limbs belong. She had dark curls that someone had attempted to discipline into ribbons and failed comprehensively, and she was sitting in one of the broad velvet chairs with her feet dangling a solid 6 inches off the floor, watching the party with the expression of a person who has been brought somewhere they didn't ask to go and is reserving judgment. Dorothea recognized that expression. She was wearing something similar herself. She didn't notice when the child left the chair. One moment the small figure was there, and then there was a warm, slightly damp pressure against the back of her left hand, and Dorothea startled, a thing she almost never did, and looked down. The child had taken her hand. Both of hers, actually. Small fingers wrapped around Dorothea's with the unconscious confidence of the very young, who have not yet learned that strangers are for keeping distance from. You looked sad, the child said. Her voice was very serious. I don't like it when people look sad at parties. Dorothea stared at her. I'm not sad, she said automatically, because that is what you say. The child studied her with large dark eyes that held the unsettling, unclouded perception of someone who has not yet learned the social grace of pretending to believe people. You were, she said simply. You looked like you were somewhere else. I look like that when I miss my mama. The sentence landed the way small things do when they hit bone. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. Just a clean, brief, complete pain. What's your name? Dorothea asked because it was easier than the alternative. Elspeth, said the child. Elspeth Aldridge. My papa is the Duke. She announced this the way children announce facts, without hierarchy, as though my papa is the Duke and I have a loose tooth carry roughly equivalent social weight. What's yours? Dorothea. Elspeth tried it silently, her mouth forming the syllables. That's a big name. It is. I'll call you Thea. She had apparently decided. Thea, will you tell me a story? The ones the nursemaid tells are very boring and have too many morals. Dorothea should have said no. She should have redirected the child to the nurses or the footmen, located her father, restored the natural order of a ball where the paid companion of an elderly countess does not sit in a drawing-room chair inventing stories for a duke's daughter. She knew this. She understood it completely. She sat down in the chair beside Elspeth. She couldn't have said precisely why later. Perhaps it was the small hand still wrapped around hers, certain and warm. Perhaps it was that Elspeth had said you looked sad and Dorothea hadn't known, hadn't realized the sadness had climbed out from somewhere inside and made itself visible on her face. And the shock of being seen even by a child, even by accident, had broken something open in her chest she'd packed shut very thoroughly. Very well, she said. No morals. What sort of story? One with a brave girl, Elspeth said, immediate and certain. And something beautiful she finds. And no one dies. No one dies, Dorothea agreed. She began. She was 4 sentences in when she became aware of someone standing in the doorway. She felt him before she saw him. Not in any mystical sense, just the particular awareness of being watched by someone who is not moving, not announcing themselves, not doing anything except standing very still and listening. When she glanced up, blinking against the candlelight that softened everything at this distance into warm shapes and suggestion, she caught the outline of a man, tall, dark-coated, with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from training but from genuine surprise. He was watching Elspeth. Then slowly he was watching her. Dorothea looked back down at the child. Elspeth had pressed closer, one small shoulder against Dorothea's arm, mouth slightly open, entirely absorbed. One with a brave girl, she had asked. And something beautiful she finds. Dorothea continued the story. Her voice didn't waver. But something quietly had shifted, the way the room shifts just before someone opens a window. No wind yet. Just the change in air that tells you something is coming. He apologized first. That was the thing Dorothea would remember later, when she was alone in the narrow room Lady Petworth kept for her at Harwick House, lying on top of the covers with her boots still on because she'd sat down meaning to think for just a moment and hadn't moved since. Not the way he looked, though she would remember that too, in the imprecise, blurred way she remembered most things now. A tall shape with kind eyes and a mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to arrange itself into anything casual. Not the fact that he was a duke, which was the sort of detail that should matter and somehow didn't. What she remembered first was that he apologized. Not the polished, reflexive kind. Not the forgive my daughter, she troubles everyone dismissal that she had already braced for, shoulders squared, pleasantness prepared like a shield. He crossed the room, she heard his footsteps before she could resolve his features. And he crouched down, actually crouched so that he was level with Elspeth, and he said, Sprite. You've stolen this lady's entire evening, haven't you? It wasn't a question. His voice was low and carried the particular roughness of a man who doesn't perform his emotions but can't quite hide them either. Elspeth looked deeply unrepentant. We're in the middle, she said. In the middle of the story. She said this with the devastating patience of someone explaining arithmetic to someone slow. Thea was telling me about the girl who found the door in the winter garden. We haven't found out what's behind it yet. He looked up then. Directly at Dorothea. She met it, his gaze, with the practiced steadiness she brought to everything now, the slight centering of attention that compensated for what the edges of her vision had stopped giving her. Up close he resolved better. Late 30s perhaps. Dark hair that had begun its negotiation with gray at the temples. A face that wasn't handsome in the arranged, deliberate way of men who know they're being looked at, but rather in the way of someone who has felt things genuinely and at length. And the face has kept a record. I'm James Aldridge, he said. I am deeply sorry. She does this. Collects strangers? Something happened in his expression. Not quite a smile, More the precursor to one, the thing that lives just before the smile arrives. Appoints them, he said. She appointed our undergardener as her official beetle finder last spring. The man is 62 and has opinions about begonias. He is now entirely devoted to her. And the beetles? Also devoted. He straightened, she tracked the movement, and for a moment stood there in the way of a man who knows the correct thing would be to retrieve his daughter and restore order to the evening and has looked at that option and found he doesn't quite want to take it yet. You don't have to finish the story, he said. Truly. I can take her too. I want to know what's behind the door, Elspeth said. Dorothea looked at the child. Then slowly she looked back at him. So do I, she said. She finished the story. He stayed. He didn't sit. That would have been too deliberate, too committed in the way of a man who is trying not to make anyone uncomfortable by the fact of his presence. Instead he leaned against the wall nearby, arms folded loosely, and listened in the manner of someone who came to collect a child and found themselves briefly unmoored. Dorothea was aware of him the entire time. It was difficult not to be. He had the quality, rare in her experience in men of any station, of giving a room his actual attention rather than the performance of it. Behind the door in the winter garden, she decided, was a library that no one else could find. Only the brave girl. Only her. Elspeth was asleep against her shoulder before the library had been properly described. The small weight of her, warm, boneless, entirely trusting in the way children sleep against people they have decided to trust without anyone's permission, was something Dorothea did not let herself examine directly. It sat beside the other things she didn't examine directly. The soft life she had imagined once, before the physician, before Clerkenwell, before the careful reorganization of what was possible for a woman whose world was shrinking in a way no one could see. She does this too, James Aldrich said quietly. His voice was different now that Elspeth was sleeping. Softer, less careful, the way voices go when the audience has reduced to someone who might actually be listening. Trusts completely. Without asking anyone if it's acceptable. It's a gift, Dorothea said. He meant it plainly. It came out sounding like something else, something more private, and she felt the slight heat of that in her face. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. It is. A beat. The music from the ballroom reached them muffled and distant. That same waltz or one very like it. Someone had finally started dancing. Miss, he started. Crane, she said. Dorothea Crane. I am Lady Petworth's companion. I should. She glanced toward the Countess, a blur of grey and pearls still absorbed in the woman in green. She doesn't need me for another quarter hour at least. Then stay, he said. And then, as though the word had surprised him too, if you'd like. We could. She'll wake if I move her. This was, they both understood, not entirely true. Elspeth was comprehensively, profoundly asleep, and a man who had clearly been carrying her to and from beds for 4 years or 5 knew that perfectly well. But Dorothea looked down at the small dark curls against her shoulder and said, of course. They talked. Not about significant things, not at first. He asked how she found London in winter. She told him it was best understood by sound rather than sight, which she said lightly, off-handedly, meaning nothing by it, and then felt the familiar small lurch of having said more than she intended. He didn't press it. He told her that Elspeth had become passionate about astronomy after the undergardener, the beetle man, had shown her Saturn through a borrowed telescope in September, and that she now required a full account of the stars every evening before sleep would be considered. Every evening? Dorothea said. Every evening. I have learned more about Saturn's rings than any man in Parliament, I assure you. And do you mind? He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read at this distance, in this light, with what her eyes could and couldn't do. No, he said simply. I don't mind anything she asks of me. That's the difficulty. That's the difficulty. She filed that phrase away in the careful internal cabinet where she kept things that mattered. A father who loves his daughter to the point of difficulty. Who crouches to her eye level at a ball to apologize. Who stays beside a stranger and talks about Saturn because his daughter is sleeping and the evening is long and something in the room has quietly shifted. When Lady Petworth finally signaled, a particular angle of the Countess's chin that Dorothea had learned to read the way sailors read weather. She lifted Elspeth carefully and passed her to him. The child stirred, murmured something that might have been the door, and settled against his chest with the certainty of someone returning to a place that belongs to them. He looked at Dorothea over his daughter's head. "The garden walks," he said. "On Thursday afternoons, along the south path by Aldbridge House. Elspeth insists. She's told me." He paused. "She hasn't told me. She told me just now in my head while she was asleep. This is not how I—" He stopped. "Tried again. Would you come?" Dorothea thought of Thursday. Of the south path which she didn't know. Of her world which was smaller than it used to be and growing smaller, and the particular cruelty of beginning to want things precisely now. "Yes," she said. She walked back to Lady Petworth's side with her hands folded and her face arranged into its practiced pleasantness. But her left hand, the one Elspeth had held, small fingers certain and warm, she kept still at her side. She didn't fold that one. Thursday came the way good things do when you are trying not to want them, too slowly and then all at once. Dorothea arrived at the south gate of Aldbridge House at 2:30, having walked from Harwick House at a pace that was slower than necessary and faster than dignified, stopping twice to check the address against the card he had pressed into her hand at the ball, which she had read so many times in the intervening days that she had stopped needing to read it and started doing it anyway, just to have a reason to hold the thing. The south path was gravel, she discovered. Fine gravel, well kept, which was useful because it gave her feet information her eyes were increasingly reluctant to provide. She had worn her grey walking dress, not her best, which would have been too obvious, and not her worst, which would have been dishonest, and her second-best gloves with the small pearl buttons at the wrist that had belonged to her mother and were therefore entirely impractical and entirely non-negotiable. Elspeth was already at the gate. She was wearing a yellow coat that had seen better seasons and holding something. Dorothea couldn't make it out until she was closer, and then she could. A large, somewhat battered book with a cloth cover the color of midnight. "I brought the stars," Elspeth announced. "Papa said we might look at them if the sky is clear tonight, but I wanted to show you in the book first because the pictures are better than the real ones in some ways." "Are they?" "The real ones don't have labels," Elspeth said seriously. A footstep on the gravel behind the child, and then James Aldridge appeared from the shadow of the gate arch, hat in hand, and he looked. Dorothea registered this involuntarily, the way you register a change in temperature, like a man who had also spent some portion of the last 4 days thinking about Thursday. "She's been at the gate since 2:00, he said. "I wanted to be first," Elspeth said without apology. They walked. The south path curved through a formal garden that had been allowed, in the way of gardens tended by people with more grief than time, to soften slightly at the edges. Roses gone to rose hips. Lavender stripped by November but still present as scent, faint and persistent, rising when they brushed past. Elspeth ran ahead in the impulsive, recursive way of children. Forward 20 paces, back 10, forward again, diverted suddenly by a beetle or a particularly interesting stone, the star book clutched against her chest like a shield. James walked beside Dorothea with a deliberateness that was not quite casual and not quite formal and occupied the complicated territory between them with, she noticed this, an absolute absence of the pointed helpfulness she had been bracing for. He did not take her arm uninvited. He did not slow his pace in the exaggerated way of people who have decided you need managing. He walked beside her at a natural pace on a path she was learning by feel, and he talked and he listened, and occasionally he said things like "there's a step down just here," in the same tone he used for everything else. Informational, unloaded, the way you tell someone the weather. She had not expected that. She didn't know what she'd expected. Pity, perhaps, in its various sophisticated forms. The particular kindness that looks at a difficulty and can't stop looking, that means well and exhausts you regardless. She had become practiced at recognizing it. It arrived in the slight softening of voices, the over-gentle offers, the way people unconsciously moved things out of her path before she'd had the chance to navigate them herself. Kindness as a form of erasure. She knew it wasn't malicious. She had forgiven it in everyone who'd offered it. But it had taught her to want very little from very few people, which was its own kind of damage. James Aldridge, she was discovering, did not look at her difficulty. He looked at her. It was disorienting. They were 20 minutes into the walk before Elspeth materialized between them, breathless, holding the star book open to a page that Dorothea brought close to read. A diagram of Orion, the hunter, his belt, 3 careful dots in a line. Papa said Orion is best in winter, Elspeth said. He said you can find him if you know where to look. I haven't found him yet, but I've been looking. She squinted up at the pale afternoon sky as though Orion might oblige by appearing early. Do you know the stars, Thea? Some of them, Dorothea said. My father taught me Cassiopeia. The W shape. He said once you find one, the others come easier. Did they? Eventually. Elspeth considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Then she closed the star book and tucked her free hand into Dorothea's, the same way she had at the ball, without asking, without ceremony, with the absolute confidence of someone who has never been refused and does not expect to start being refused now. Dorothea's chest did something complicated. She glanced sideways at James. He was watching Elspeth with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his. Not quite smiling, but the whole arrangement of his face was softer, as though the muscles had released something they usually held. He felt her look and met it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She trusts completely, he had said at the ball. Without asking anyone if it's acceptable. The following 3 Thursdays arrived and departed in a pattern that Dorothea did not let herself call a pattern, because naming it felt dangerous, felt like something that could be taken away more easily once it was named. He walked beside her each time. He described things, not because she asked, not in the compensatory over-thorough way she dreaded, but naturally, as though sharing what he saw was simply what you did when you were with someone. The rose hips on the east wall are the color of embers today. There's a wren on the gatepost. Extraordinary how small they are. Small offerings. Handed over without ceremony. He began to do the same. To name what she still had. The gravel sounds different under the beech trees. Softer. The lavender is completely gone now, but the smell stays. I don't know why. He listened the way people listen when they aren't waiting for their turn to speak. On the 4th Thursday, Elspeth was kept indoors with a cold. A fact communicated via a note delivered that morning in a child's unsteady handwriting, the letters enormous and effortful. I am sick, but Papa will still come if you still come. Please still come. E. Dorothea read the note 4 times. Then she put on her second-best gloves and went. They walked without Elspeth, which was different in ways she hadn't prepared for. Without the child running ahead, the path felt longer and quieter and more intimate than she'd understood it to be. They were just 2 people walking. The path was just a path. He had brought a book. She didn't notice it until they reached the stone bench at the garden's far end, where the path opened out into a view of the winter-stripped orchard, and he paused and said, May I? Elspeth mentioned you said you used to read Tennyson. I wasn't sure if... He stopped. Started again. I thought perhaps if you were willing I might read aloud. While we sat. If that would be... Yes, she said. Before he'd finished the sentence. He sat beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the slight shift of weight when he settled, the particular quality of another person's presence in cold air. He opened the book. He read. His voice reading was different from his voice speaking. Something loosened in it. The roughness she'd noticed became something else, became texture rather than tension, became a voice that clearly had read aloud to a small girl many times and had stopped performing for it long ago and just meant it. She closed her eyes. This was a thing she did now, sometimes when a sound or a smell or a sensation was worth having completely. She closed her eyes and let it be the whole of the world because the world was managing itself without her attention to its edges. She was aware of this as a private surrender. A small white flag she flew only alone. She flew it now. When he finished the poem he paused and she opened her eyes, and he was looking at her with something in his face she wasn't certain she was reading correctly. He had gone still the way he went still when he was feeling something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. You closed your eyes, he said. Not an accusation. Not an observation designed to reveal anything. Just a gentle noting the way you note weather. I do that, she said. When I want to hear better. A beat. The orchard bare and silver in the November light. Then I'll read it again, he said. If you'd like. She turned to look at him properly. This careful, quiet man who had crouched to his daughter's level and learned Saturn's rings and described ember-colored rosehips without being asked, and felt the pull of him with the specific, terrible clarity of a woman who knows she is standing at the edge of something she cannot afford and cannot make herself step back from. Yes, she said. Please. He found the page. He began again. The cold settled around them both and neither of them moved. It started with a door. Not a metaphorical one, though those were accumulating too, quietly, in the manner of things that gather in corners before you notice the weight of them. An actual door. The servants' entrance to Harwick House, which Dorothea had been navigating for 11 months without incident, until the Tuesday morning in December when the threshold shifted, or her foot misjudged it, or the light through the narrow window had changed with the season, and she went down hard on her left knee on the stone step with a sound she felt more than heard, a dull, intimate crack that belonged to her body and no one else. She sat there a moment. On the step. In the cold. The housemaid, Bet, 16, good-hearted, incapable of tact, came around the corner and said, "Oh, Miss Crane," in a voice that contained everything Dorothea had spent the last year engineering her life to avoid hearing in other people's voices. He helped her up. She fluttered. She said, "Shall I fetch someone?" 3 times in different configurations while Dorothea held the doorframe and breathed and felt the particular humiliation of a body that has betrayed you in front of a witness. "No," Dorothea said. "Steady. Practiced." "Thank you, Bet. I missed the step. It's quite a high one." "Yes." She moved inside. She didn't limp until she reached the back stairs where no one could see. The knee healed in a week. The thing it had cracked open in her took considerably longer. She had been managing. That was the word she returned to in the sleepless hours. Managing, as though her life were an account ledger requiring constant adjustment, columns of loss balanced against columns of competence. She had been managing the ball and the walks and James Aldridge and Elspeth's hand in hers and the Tennyson on the cold bench, managing all of it with the disciplined detachment of a woman who knows the price of wanting and has decided she will simply not pay it. Not accumulate the debt. Not let the wanting grow large enough to notice. The step had noticed for her. She lay on top of her covers that Tuesday night and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was fine, the ceiling was close enough and pale enough to still be simply a ceiling, and she conducted a clear-eyed inventory of herself. 31 years old. A paid companion. No family of substance, no savings of substance, no prospects that didn't involve the continued good health and patience of an elderly countess who had recently begun to mention her niece in Hampshire with a frequency that had the quality of preparation. And her eyes. Her narrowing, softening, unreliable eyes, which had been given to her by God or nature or misfortune without her consent and were leaving her with the same indifference. She thought about James Aldridge reading Tennyson in a November garden. She thought about Elspeth's star book and the enormous letters of the note, "Please still come," and felt the wanting move through her like something physical, like cold water head to foot. Then she thought about the door at Harwick House. The step she hadn't seen. Betty's voice. "Shall I fetch someone?" She thought about what it would mean to be fetched for. To be the woman in that house. His house, Elspeth's house. The house with ember-colored rosehips and Saturn's rings and Tennyson read twice over. And to be the thing in it that needed managing. To watch his eyes do what everyone's eyes eventually did. The slow recalibration from person to difficulty, from Dorothea to the woman with the eyes. She thought about Elspeth, who trusted completely and without permission, and what it would do to that child to attach herself to someone who was going to need more than she could give in return. She sat up. He found the candle. She wrote the note by the warmth of it, because it was one of the things she could still do if the light was close and the letters were large enough and she didn't rush. "Dear Mr. Aldridge, I find I must reduce my outside engagements for the foreseeable future. Please convey my fondness to Elspeth. She is a remarkable child." He Crane. She sealed it before she could read it again. He didn't accept it. Not immediately, not with any drama. He wasn't a man built for drama, she had come to understand, the way some buildings aren't built for height. It simply wasn't the direction his nature went. But 4 days after the note, A package arrived at Harwick House addressed in his handwriting. Inside, wrapped in brown paper with no particular elegance. A book. Small. Cloth covered. Dark blue. Inside the front cover in his hand. The descriptions in Chapter 7. Salt marshes at dawn. I thought of you when I read them. Not to be managed. Just to be shared. J.A. Dorothea sat with the book in her lap for a long time. Then she put it on the shelf beside her bed where she kept the things she touched in the dark when sleep wouldn't come. Her mother's gloves, a smooth river stone from her girlhood that she couldn't have explained the keeping of, a letter from a school friend long since moved to Edinburgh. She didn't write back. But she didn't return the book. The second delivery came a week later. This one she heard before she saw it. A small, insistent knocking at the Harwick House front door that the butler answered with the slow indignation of a man interrupted at something important. And then the particular silence that follows when the person at the door is unexpected but not unwelcome. Accompanied by her nursemaid, a patient Yorkshirewoman named Mrs. Thorpe who wore the expression of someone who had been voluntold into this expedition and had made her peace with it. Elspeth was wearing the yellow coat again and carrying with enormous gravity a jam jar with holes punched in the lid. Inside the jar was a beetle. He's called Tennyson, Elspeth said when Dorothea appeared in the hallway. She had been fetched, she noted, with the particular speed of a household alerted by good bet. I found him in the garden. He is very fast and very shiny. I thought he could visit you since you aren't coming to visit us. The not accusation of this, the absolute guilelessness of it, the way a child can say the true thing with none of the machinery adults used to blunt it, landed directly with no softening. Dorothea looked at the jar. At the beetle, which was in fact very shiny. Tennyson, she said. Because of the poems. Elspeth held the jar up to the window light, watching him. Papa reads them still. On Thursdays. He reads them out loud even when no one is there. I heard him. Dorothea said nothing. Mrs. Thorpe says it's not my business, Elspeth added, with the tone of someone for whom this information had not functioned as intended. They sat in Lady Petworth's small parlour for an hour. The Countess was napping, the afternoon was grey and still, and Dorothea and Elspeth sat across from each other with the beetle jar between them and talked about stars and beetles and whether winter was better or worse than autumn and the relative merits of hot milk versus hot chocolate. And Dorothea felt the ache of it like a bruise pressed, like cold water again but slower this time, spreading rather than rushing. When they left, Elspeth departing with the beetle, having decided he was homesick, Dorothea stood at the window and watched the yellow coat disappear down the street into the grey December until she couldn't resolve it any more from the rest of the pale blur of the afternoon. She reads aloud on Thursdays. Even when no one is there. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. Outside, London continued its grey indifferent business, carts and footsteps and the distant call of a vendor whose words dissolved before they reached her. He fell in love with her, something inside her said. Not the woman he might rescue. Her. Dorothea Crane, who misjudged steps and filed pain neatly away and named the things she could still smell because she was losing the things she could see and had decided to love the world on whatever terms it offered. He fell in love with her. And then, beneath it, quieter and more honest and more frightening. I know. She pushed herself back from the window. She straightened her dress. She went to help Lady Petworth with her evening correspondence, because there were things to be done and she was still here to do them, still capable, still herself, still Dorothea. And that was both the problem and the only thing she had to hold. In her room that night she took the blue book from the shelf. She opened Chapter 7. Salt marshes at dawn. She read it twice. Then she found her writing paper. She sat there a long time before she wrote anything. The candle burned low. Outside, London settled into its late noises. Fewer hooves, more wind, the particular hush of a city deciding it is done for the day. Finally she wrote. Chapter 7. Yes. D. 2 words and an initial. She sealed it before she could take them back. The letter sat on his desk for 3 days before he replied. She knew this because Elspeth told her. Elspeth, who had appointed herself an unofficial courier between two people who were conducting what might have been a correspondence or might have been something more careful than that and hadn't yet decided which, arrived at Harwick House the following Saturday with Mrs. Thorpe and the beetle jar again, Tennyson having apparently recovered from his homesickness, and informed Dorothea with no preamble that her papa had read the letter. She said it the way you say the letter, waited, singular, 6 times before breakfast on Wednesday. How do you know? Dorothea asked. Because I counted, Elspeth said simply. He thinks I'm asleep but I hear the paper. Dorothea looked at the child. Elspeth looked back with her large dark eyes that missed nothing and apologized for none of it. You counted, Dorothea repeated. 6, Elspeth confirmed. The 7th time he put it in his coat pocket. He's had it there since. She reached into the jar to relocate Tennyson to a more interesting position. Mrs. Thorpe says that's not my business either. Mrs. Thorpe is right, Dorothea said. Said Elspeth in the tone of someone who has heard this position before and remains unmoved by it. His reply came on Thursday. Not a note. Not a book this time, though she'd half expected one. He had a librarian's instinct for meeting emotion with pages, as though the right words already existed and only needed locating. Instead it was a letter, 3 pages, his handwriting tighter than usual in the way of a person who is saying something they've rewritten several times and still aren't certain of. She read it at her window in the best morning light. The paper held closer than she would have held it a year ago, the words taking shape in the way words did for her now. Slowly, with intention, like objects surfacing from water. He wrote about Elspeth first. He always wrote about Elspeth first, she'd noticed. It was his way of beginning somewhere safe before going anywhere that cost him. Elspeth had declared that beetles were superior to butterflies because they don't show off, which he found philosophically interesting. Elspeth had asked him last Tuesday why sad people sometimes looked happy and happy people sometimes looked sad, and he had not had a sufficient answer. He was working on one. Then, I have been trying to find the right words for something since November. I am not certain right words exist for it, but I have been trying regardless because you deserve the attempt even if the execution fails. You wrote, Chapter 7, yes, and I have been carrying it since Wednesday in my coat pocket like a man who has found something he was not looking for and is frightened of putting it down in case it turns out to be a different thing than he thought when he picks it up again. I don't think it is a different thing. I know you have stepped back. I know why. Or I think I know why, and I want to be wrong, but I am not foolish enough to pretend certainty where I have none. What I can tell you with certainty is this. I read Tennyson on Thursdays because that is when the garden is your absence most specifically. I have described the rose hips to no one since November because they are yours to be described to. I am not telling you this to pressure or to claim anything. I am telling you because you are a woman who values truth in its plain form, and I think you deserve to have it plainly. If you are afraid, I understand that too. I have been afraid since the evening in the drawing room when a woman I had never met told my daughter a story about a door in a winter garden, and I stood in the doorway and could not make myself interrupt. Come to the garden. Thursday. If you want to. J. Dorothea read it twice. The second time more slowly, her lips moving slightly on certain phrases the way they did when she wanted to keep something. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket, where it sat against her ribs all day like a warm coal, like something alive. She went on Thursday. She told herself the whole walk there that she was going to tell him clearly and kindly that it was not possible. That she had thought about it with the seriousness it deserved and arrived at the only reasonable conclusion. She had rehearsed it on the walk from Harwick House, the words arranged and ready. I think very highly of you, I am fond of Elspeth. There is no version of this that doesn't end with me becoming something you carry rather than someone you chose. And the words had stayed arranged all the way to the south gate, which she found by the sound of the gravel change under her boots and the iron smell of the latch. And she had her hand on it, she was ready, when the gate opened from the other side. He was there. He had his coat collar up against the December cold and his hat in his hand, which meant he'd just removed it, which meant he'd been watching for her from somewhere close. His face when he saw her did the thing it sometimes did, that unguarded, unperformed thing. And for a moment she saw it very clearly, the way she sometimes still saw things that were close enough and still enough. Relief. Simple and undecorated. You came, he said. I came to tell you, she started. I know, he said. Tell me while we walk. She told him. Not the rehearsed version. That one dissolved somewhere in the first 50 paces. The words becoming unnecessary in their careful arrangement when the real ones were pressing to get out. She told him about Clerkenwell. About the physician and his gentleness and his thoroughness and the November rain and the umbrella she hadn't seen. She told him about the reorganization of a life around a broken floorboard, the furniture moved so no one trips, the way you stop telling guests because what is there to tell. She told him about the step at Harwick House and Betty's voice and the humiliation that was not about falling but about being seen falling, about the specific exhaustion of a body that requires workarounds, that requires patience, that requires management. She said, I will not be managed by someone who loves me. I would rather be alone. She had stopped walking when she said it. They were in the middle of the path, the bare orchard ahead, the winter sky the color of old pewter above them, and she said it to the middle distance because she couldn't say it to his face, couldn't manage his face while managing the words. A silence. Then, who said anything about managing you? She turned. He was closer than she'd realized. The path was narrow here, they had been walking close and he had stopped when she stopped, and he was looking at her with an expression she felt rather than read, felt in the quality of the air between them, the particular stillness of a man who is holding something very carefully. You will need, she started. Dorothea. Her name in his mouth. Not Miss Crane, not the formal careful distance of it, just her name, 2 syllables, the way he'd said it once by accident in the 3rd week and then hadn't again until now. What do you think I have been doing in this garden for 2 months? She said nothing. Learning it, he said. I have been learning it. Where the gravel changes. Where the step is before the bench. Which direction the afternoon light comes from and what it does to the east wall. He paused. I measured the path last week. 240 paces from the south gate to the orchard, with a slight turn left at the stone urn. I know because I walked it in the dark. She stared at him. Not because you need me to, he said, and his voice was low and entirely serious and contained something that she recognized as the sound of truth in its plain form, the thing he had promised her in the letter. Because I wanted to know what you know. Because this, he gestured briefly at the path, the garden, the bare trees, is yours. The way you move through it. The way you know it. I wanted to understand that. He stopped. Exhaled. You are not a burden I have agreed to carry, Dorothea. You are the woman who told my daughter about the door in the winter garden and looked sad at a ball and carries her mother's gloves and names the things she can smell because she is, because you are. He stopped again. He was close enough now that she could see his face clearly, all of it without the soft edges the distance imposed, just his face as it was, the lines of it, the gray at his temples, the expression on him that was both frightened and entirely certain in the way of someone who has decided to stop being afraid of the right thing. You close your eyes when you want to hear better, he said quietly. And every time you do, I understand exactly who I am in love with. The cold air. The pewter sky. The 240 paces of gravel she had memorized and he had walked in the dark. She had intended to step back. Her body had other ideas, or not even ideas, just the simple animal certainty of proximity and warmth and a man who had measured a garden path in darkness not to rescue her but to stand beside her in her world rather than pulling her into his. She closed her eyes. Not because the light was going. Because she wanted to hear this completely. His breath was close. His hand came up, she felt rather than saw it, and rested with extraordinary care along her jaw, the lightest possible contact, asking rather than telling, the way he did everything. Dorothea, he said. Yes, she said. It wasn't an answer to a question. It was the answer to everything he had been saying since November. The rose hips, the Tennyson, the 6 times before breakfast, the dark garden path measured in secret. All of it gathered into one word, small as a key, weightless as a hand pressed into hers by a child who had looked at a sad stranger at a ball and simply, without permission, decided. The kiss when it came was not a beginning. It was a recognition. Quiet as shared silence. Steady as a voice reading aloud to an empty garden on a Thursday afternoon. The pewter sky held above them. London moved in its distant perpetual way. And in the stripped winter garden of Aldbridge House, the last light of December settled over 2 people who had found in the careful measure of small things. A path walked in darkness, a key carried in a pocket, a beetle named for a poet. The particular and irreplaceable truth that love, real love, does not arrive to rescue you from your life. It arrives to stand inside it with you, to learn its dimensions, to walk it in the dark, and to stay. Elspeth, when told, said only, "I knew." She went back to her beetles. Tennyson, for the record, was released into the garden the following spring. He was last seen near the lavender, moving very fast, being very shiny, unbothered entirely by the world's opinion of him. As all the best ones are. That's a wrap, loves. If this story found you at the right moment, if it sat somewhere in your chest the way good stories do, tell me in the comments. Tell me which part got you. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your sign. Until next time. Charlotte's Title Whispers. Where the stories find you.